Calder Moss never believed in second chances. Life had taken nearly everything from him: his job, his marriage, and his sense of purpose. When the letter arrived, saying he'd inherited his late father's house on a cliff overlooking the ocean, it felt more like a cruel joke than a blessing. He hadn't spoken to his father, Warren, in over 10 years. Their last conversation ended in anger, and silence had followed ever since. But standing in that crumbling Victorian home, with his 8-year-old daughter Bryn at his side, Calder couldn't ignore how strange it felt. The air smelled of dust and salt. The walls held ghostly memories. That night, as the wind howled outside and the waves pounded the rocks below, Calder noticed something hidden: a narrow stone staircase carved into the cliffside. Curiosity pushed him forward. Flashlight in hand, he descended, step by slippery step, until he reached a rusted iron door. It resisted at first, then gave way with a groan. Inside was a small cavern filled with journals, maps, and old photographs. The air smelled like paper and sea salt. On the first journal's cover, in careful handwriting, were the words, "If Ember Bay doesn't adapt, it will die." Calder didn't know it yet, but this discovery would change not just his life, it would rewrite his family's entire legacy. The next morning, Calder couldn't stop thinking about what he'd found. The cavern wasn't random junk. It was an archive, his father's secret project. Warren Moss had been a quiet accountant, a man of precision and routine, not mystery. Yet here was proof he'd been hiding something monumental. Inside the journals, Calder found letters, reports, even meeting notes from the town council decades ago. The entries told a story of a man fighting to save a dying fishing town, a man who believed Ember Bay could survive if its people worked together. But the council had mocked him, called him a dreamer, and turned him away. As Calder read, a slow realization set in. His father hadn't been distant because he didn't care. He'd been consumed by something he couldn't let go. Then came the letters, dozens of them, each one addressed to Calder. Birthday after birthday, milestone after milestone, unsent letters filled with words his father never had the courage to speak aloud. "I hope you know I love you," one read, "even when I didn't know how to show it." By the time Calder reached the last letter, written just weeks before Warren's death, he was crying. His father hadn't abandoned him. He'd been trying to protect him and their town all along. That night, Calder looked out over the dark ocean and whispered, "I understand now, Dad." Days turned into weeks as Calder studied every page his father left behind. He learned that Warren had spent 40 years fighting to build a community fishing cooperative, a plan that could have saved Ember Bay from the slow death it was now facing. Developers were buying up land, promising luxury resorts and economic revival, but Calder saw through it. It was a lie dressed as progress. One evening, Mrs. Finch, his elderly neighbor, brought him a newspaper. "They're taking the whole waterfront," she said quietly. A company called Tidewater Holdings had already bought half the town. Calder knew then what he had to do. His father's plan wasn't just a dream, it was a blueprint. And maybe if he could rebuild it, he could save the town and finally finish the work his father died trying to complete. He began visiting fishermen, showing them Warren's research. Most were skeptical. Some laughed. But a few listened. One of them, Hiro Tanaka, saw what Calder saw, a chance to take their livelihoods back. Slowly, they began to form a small group. It wasn't much, but it was a start, a spark against the darkness that had covered Ember Bay for decades. The moment the cooperative gained traction, the pushback began. A man named Brent Holloway, Tidewater's smiling, silver-tongued representative, started showing up everywhere: at the diner, the marina, town meetings, promising jobs, money, and an easy future. But behind that smile was quiet menace. One morning, Calder found a letter slipped under his door. "You don't understand what you're messing with. Take your kid and leave." Fear twisted in his gut. He sent Bryn to stay with Mrs. Finch for safety and went straight to the sheriff, who could do little without proof. Still, Calder refused to quit. Then came the breaking point. Someone broke into his house and ransacked his father's archive. Files, letters, maps gone. The cavern was torn apart. Calder knew who had done it. When Holloway called later that night pretending to offer sympathy, Calder's voice shook with fury. "You can take the papers," he said, "but you'll never erase what he built." What Holloway didn't know was that Calder had already scanned every critical document. Warren's work lived on in the cloud, beyond their reach, beyond their control. For the first time, Calder realized he was no longer just defending his father's legacy. He was leading a fight. 2 days after the break-in, fate handed Calder a weapon. While cleaning the ruined cavern, he found a sealed envelope taped under a drawer. It was marked in his father's handwriting. "Insurance." Inside was a flash drive and a letter written 1 week before Warren's death. The letter revealed everything. Warren had discovered that Tidewater was corrupt to the core. They'd falsified environmental reports, bribed inspectors, and illegally dumped waste into protected waters. He'd confronted their representative, Brent Holloway, just days before he died. Heart attack, they'd said, no autopsy. Calder's hands shook as he read those words. His father hadn't just been ignored, he'd been silenced. Calder took the evidence to the local deputy, who promised to forward it to federal authorities. That night when he told Mrs. Finch, she only whispered, "Your father was brave, braver than anyone knew." And this time, Calder didn't feel helpless, he felt ready. When the truth reached a documentary filmmaker in Portland, she came to Ember Bay within a week. Cameras rolled as Calder and the fishermen rebuilt what the vandals destroyed. The footage of their struggle, combined with Warren's evidence, caught fire online. Soon, the Environmental Protection Agency opened an investigation into Tidewater's crimes. Ember Bay became the center of a storm, one small town standing against a giant. The townspeople gathered in the hall where Warren had once been laughed out of the room. Calder took the same stage his father had decades ago and held up an old black-and-white photo. "This," he said, "is proof that we can build something real. My grandfather helped start the first cooperative. My father tried to rebuild it. Now it's our turn." The audience fell silent, the weight of history filling the room. When the vote came, 23 families agreed to join, enough to make the cooperative real. Enough to give Ember Bay a heartbeat again. Tidewater didn't go quietly. Holloway launched a media campaign calling Calder a fraud and the cooperative a fantasy. But the truth had already spread. When the town council met to vote on Tidewater's development permit, the hall was overflowing. Cameras captured every tense second. The company's lawyers spoke first, painting a picture of progress and prosperity. Then Calder stood, holding his father's final letter. He read it aloud, his voice breaking but firm. When he finished, the room was silent. Even Holloway couldn't fake confidence anymore. The council voted, 2 for Tidewater, 2 against. The final vote fell to the chairwoman. She looked at Calder, at the families behind him, then at the company that had lied to them all. "I vote to deny the permit," she said. The crowd erupted. Cheers, tears, and disbelief filled the air. Ember Bay had chosen itself. The people had won. Months later, Ember Bay was alive again. Fishing boats painted with the cooperative's new logo set out every dawn, their engines humming like hope. Families who had once been strangers now worked side by side. Restaurants reopened, schools filled with laughter, and Calder's daughter Bryn could finally grow up in a town that believed in itself again. On the cliff, the old house had been restored, its foundations solid, its windows bright. Below it, the iron door to the cavern now bore a plaque, in memory of Warren Moss, the man who never stopped believing. As the sun set over the Pacific, Calder stood with Bryn, watching the boats return, their nets full and their future secure. "Do you think Grandpa knows?" she asked softly. Calder smiled. "I think he's the reason we're still here." The waves crashed against the rocks below, steady and endless like legacy itself. If this story touched you, hit that follow button. Share it with someone who believes in hope, and remember, every fight worth having starts with one person brave enough to begin.